Unlock Season 14 with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of film, a dimension of scares, a dimension of discussion. You're moving into a land of both humor and substance, of facts and intros. You've just crossed over into the Horrific Podcast. All right, so we're rolling through these. We are talking this season about episodes of the Twilight Zone that had an impact on horror movies that followed them. Yes, that's an oddly specific theme for a season, but no, I'm not apologizing for it.
Mm-mm.
We needed to do a little bit of a reset season because season the 13th went on for, 10 years. And it ended with us talking about cults and reading and learning a lot about them. And it was depressing. And we just needed a little pick-me-up before we got into another kind of bigger, more thought-through season. So, we're just doing a few of these episodes where we're talking about Twilight Zone and some of our favorite horror movies and how those things are related. And that's what you're going to get for a couple more weeks.
Yeah. I mean, and realistically, to you guys listening, this is something we do and we don't take too many breaks from. So, it can kind of get mushy sometimes with seasons and, movies that you've done and all that. And it's I just wanted a palate cleanser. And so that's why we went with Twilight Zone. And yet again, I'm not apologizing for shit. Ever.
I feel like you're trying to smooth things over. I want to say, if people don't like that we're doing Twilight Zone episodes, just let us know and we'll start doing Westerns again.
We just want you guys to listen.
Yeah. Anyway. So we are back this week and we're going to cover an episode called One More Pallbearer, which was from season 3 of the Twilight Zone, episode 17 in 1962. In this episode, a multimillionaire named Paul invites 3 people who have wronged him in the past to come visit him in his new bomb shelter. Once they arrive, he plans on tricking them by playing fake air raid sirens and news broadcasts and then telling them that they can only stay and survive if they apologize to him. They all decide they'd rather die with loved ones than live with Paul. Then things get really crazy.
Yep.
So I know that I've seen this one in the past, but I think I've probably only seen it once. I only very, very vaguely remembered it. Yeah. And so the ending still got me by surprise, which we'll get into later. And I haven't been surprised by a Twilight Zone episode in a long time, so that was kind of awesome.
Yeah. My guess, because I had similar situation with it, but my guess for that was when we would watch them on TV, because, we're old and we haven't always had streaming and we had to watch it on TV, we would just catch the meat of it, we wouldn't wake up for the beginning. We'd wake up. I'm talking about the marathons that they would have. You'd wake up and you start watching. And so we'd probably watch season 2 through 3 or 2 through 4, but not as much for the first or last season. So when I started watching it again, when streaming was big, the first season was almost like a new season to me because I've watched a lot of the meat, but not a lot of the ending. So I can definitely see how that can be a thing.
Yeah. But I was glad to get a chance to dive into this one because I think this one kind of has the most subtle influences of the ones that we've talked about so far. In all the ones that we have discussed so far this season, I can point to a very specific movie and say that director or writer was obviously very influenced by this episode, and they either chose to tell people that they were or they didn't, but that doesn't change the fact that they were.
Yeah.
This one, it's more okay, this episode is a really interesting premise. So can we find horror movies that we think were inspired by the ideas in this episode? And I think we did, but I just think it's less of a direct thing. But hopefully we will convince the listeners that there is some connective tissue, at least.
Listener. Mark.
Yeah, what did I say?
You pluralized it.
Oh, my bad.
It's okay.
So, you want to start us off as far as a movie that that
I'm
we think
sorry.
might be
Yeah,
a
I got
little
sidetracked.
connected here?
Yeah, I was like, do we have 2 listeners? Anyway, it has similar story beats as 10 Cloverfield Lane. So 10 Cloverfield Lane didn't originally have any ties to the Cloverfield universe. It was built out from a screenplay called The Cellar. J.J. Abrams and Bad Robot got involved. And then they brought in people from the first Cloverfield and kind of built it out to be more of that direction. So it didn't initially start out in that universe, but it ended there. But if you take out all the Cloverfield specific stuff, then you're left with what's basically a longer version of this episode with a different ending. And no Dan Connor, but still.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of similarities. And if you haven't seen 10 Cloverfield Lane, it involves people getting trapped in an underground cellar when stuff goes down. Mm-hmm. And so it's like this crazy survivalist, but is he actually crazy? Or is he just telling us all this stuff to get us to stay here because he is wanting to, kidnap us for whatever reason? Like it's a really weird, like really good psychological kind of horror sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
But if you were to take out everything that had to do with Cloverfield and you just all of a sudden have people who have been coerced into this underground bunker by a seemingly unstable megalomaniac.
Exactly.
It really kind of sounds a lot like this movie, right?
Yeah.
And then
that's the main piece for this is the megalomaniac part of connection for those two, just for the record.
Yeah. And also kind of the first fake out ending on this where, it was... Anyway, the idea of keeping the viewer confused about what's really happening versus what is just kind of being told to them. Mm-hmm. I feel like this played with expectations in a similar way.
Yeah.
And I just generally think the idea of bringing together a specific group of people and then finding out that the host's ulterior motive is something less than upfront is kind of a tried and true trope. But that goes back further, than even this episode for sure. However, the idea of creating a situation designed to get a specific reaction out of specific people was what was most interesting to me about this one in sort of like the larger horror influence. Because thinking about how he set up this elaborate room with the fake announcements and video feed and stuff to manipulate people, that kind of reminded me a lot in spirit of the Saw movies. And I'm not saying there's like a one-to-one comparison there, but I think that one thing the Twilight Zone always did effectively was find interesting premises to build stories on top of.
Yeah.
And this feels like one that we've seen play out a lot in other movies. So anyway, all of this going back to say, this one is definitely less direct as far as other influences we've discussed. But I think it's really interesting just from the perspective of like the Twilight Zone teaching Hollywood how to make compelling stories. Because I think we see echoes of this in a lot of other more modern movies.
That's actually, I think the Saw reference is actually an incredibly good point. And the reason being, because at the end of the day, the movie wants you, the people that are being, like, that are part of the Saw games to be like, oh, yeah, I've learned my ways. Like, I'll never be a drug dealer or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
But at the end of the day, that's really just to appease the megalomaniac that's behind the scenes, right? Like, as far as that, like, if he wasn't there, then they would still be going on doing whatever they want. Yeah, I like that. I like that reference a lot, actually. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that it maps better to 10 Cloverfield Lane though is just the idea of like the pending apocalypse.
Yeah.
Or like the idea of, and kind of, exactly.
Yeah. 100%.
So I think there's a lot of overlap in both as far as, ideas that were translated to kind of larger stories and made up a movie. But the one thing that I didn't find a lot of, it's actually something I really loved about this episode that I don't see reflected in horror movies as much, just because maybe it's not the way horror movies work. But just the idea that he set all of this up to convince these people that he'd held this grudge against for all these years to come like beg for his forgiveness and help. And they were just like, man, nah, we're good.
Yeah.
Like,
1,000% yes. I loved it so much.
it was really satisfying to me because they kept making you think that the people were all eventually going to turn around and come back in. Like, it was definitely set up to make it not obvious that they were going to leave up until the moment that they did. And I thought that was such a great directing choice. Like, when I realized that was actually happening, I laughed out loud. Like, I loved it. It was so good.
Yeah. It was like the justice that you wanted to happen.
Yeah.
Because you didn't want them to be like, yeah, I'm so sorry. Because no, like I don't think I would. I wouldn't believe them, I don't think, but
Yeah, that's another one where I almost feel like that premise didn't translate as well to the modern world.
yeah.
Where he's like, well, because I'm rich, I know that there's going to be a nuclear war soon. And I feel like in the 60s, people would have been like, he's probably right.
He's
Whereas
got money.
now, yeah. Whereas now it's just like, oh, yeah, he has a lot of money. That means he probably has no idea what's happening tomorrow.
Right.
He's probably
Yeah.
spent all of his time threatening to fight other billionaires or trying to build himself a rocket ship to outer space because he wanted to be an astronaut when he was a kid. And NASA said no. And I just, just the idea there. And then the technology of, oh, well, they're playing like an air raid siren. At the time, it was like, oh, well, no one could fake that. And now it's like, I mean, I could pull up 25 YouTube videos with my eyes closed playing air raid sirens that sound convincing. So
I guess the thought is like, we have access to it. It can be easily pranked or whatever, but like pranking culture is a thing here. You know, nowadays it wasn't back then. I don't know. It wasn't like you have TV shows where like that's the premise of it. So like the thought would be like, why would you actually want to like have a different raid? Like it just wouldn't comprehend. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
like
they've not seen Impractical Jokers. They're like, why would anyone spend all this money to create a fake Armageddon warning system?
Exactly. Yeah. But then also like the thing that we had with this one that we wouldn't have like in real life is like this guy was like, he's like, I'm very rich and I'm gonna appear that way. Where nowadays I feel like it's the exact opposite, where like the really rich people that want to box each other is like, see, I'm just like you guys. I'm wearing a cowboy hat right now. And you're like, you're just like us, but with like, you know, all the money in the world, hoarding it from us.
Well, and I think that illusion of, well, the amount of money I have is directly tied to how smart I am.
Exactly.
Like, that's not true. We all know that's not true at this point.
But in this episode too, it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
He's like, look how smart I am. I have this atom thing hanging from the ceiling or whatever was behind it, you know. It's like he is a genius. He does. Why would he not have that hanging in a bunker?
Clearly,
like, that just
man
makes
of science.
Sense. Yeah, he's so smart.
Yeah. It was interesting because I feel like, again, you know, we're dealing with like 4 characters for most of the episode, and they didn't really give a lot of backstory on the 3 guests other than just to point out like whatever run-in they had with him. And generally all of the dialogue was just set up to convince you that he was kind of a dick and had been since he was a kid.
Yeah.
And so it just got worse. It was like, oh yeah, he was a cheater in school. And then it's like, he didn't follow orders well in the army and a bunch of people got killed from it. And you're like, damn. And then the priest is like, well, I mean, you did make that girl kill herself. It's just like, what the hell is happening? Like, this guy sucks. Why would anyone ever accept an invitation from him? Like, I felt like it was important for the story to be believable that they, in a very short amount of time, made you in the audience really not like the guy. And I thought that they did that super effectively.
Yeah, that's true. Because, like, I definitely, by the time this episode was over with, like, had no feeling of like, oh, they shouldn't have, like, guilt or whatever for like for him, the main, I guess I'll say villain. Like I was just like, yeah, like thank God you got what you had coming. Like,
Yeah,
thank
right.
God you didn't get an apology, because that's nothing that they should have
Yes,
they should
he
have to
shouldn't have
apologize.
won.
Exactly.
Like, we did not want him to win at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that the Twilight Zone has historically done super well, that good horror movies also do, is that they create a really dislikable character. And then that is an interesting thing to work with from a movie making perspective.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes it's not even the villain, for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Sometimes in a horror movie, the person that you don't like is just a guy that you feel satisfied when the zombie eats him.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
anyway.
You're like, thank God, no more whining.
Yeah.
Like, all you did was whine this whole movie.
Well, so specifically the guy that I was thinking of is the guy whose name I can't remember, with the terrible fake accent in Anaconda. Like when the
John
Anaconda...
Voight?
Yes, John Voight, thank you.
Yeah.
When the snake finally ate him, I was just like, hell yeah, get him. He had it coming.
Thank God. Yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, I felt like a similar attitude towards Paul in this episode, where at the end he kind of got what was coming to him, and the fact that it was less satisfying when I thought that there was an apocalypse that he had survived, because then I'm like, oh, he was right, that sucks. But then when there's the twist and you realize he's just lost his mind and there was no apocalypse and he's just like crying in front of his own building, I'm like, that's where he deserved to end up.
That's the
Twilight
horror
Zone.
Ending. Yep.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
the horror ending right there. I guess technically for us it would have been more horrific if it did actually happen, but because he survived and he won technically, but no, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, and to be completely honest, I did not see that twist ending coming at all. Like the fact that the world hadn't actually ended. I thought the twist was that he had set up this elaborate hoax to convince people the world was ending, and then it actually did.
Right.
Which would have been kind of funny, to be honest.
It was also like the most empty like storm shelter of all time too. Yeah, like I think it would have been relatively easy to be like, I actually don't think this is a storm shelter. And also, I don't think that you are a millionaire based off of what you're showing off. Like, this is, you got a screen and a couple speakers and a thing hanging from the ceiling. That's not like, the world's ending. Use your freaking money, right? Anyway,
well, I mean, he was obviously not much of a survivalist.
That's true.
He's like, what do you got down here? He's like, a lot of alcohol. It's like, all right, what about a bathroom? No, sir.
Forgot about that.
Swing and a miss.
My bad.
Yeah.
That's the real horror.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if they were stuck in there too, like you were saying earlier in this episode, like that, thinking that they weren't going to be able to leave was going to be like, that adds the claustrophobic, like, oh, this is creepy as hell. Like, what if he had just walked out and shut the thing on them because they refused to, refused to apologize? But they were damned if they do, damned if they don't, technically in their minds, I guess. But still.
I also feel like I would be remiss not to point out the difference in the attitudes of the police when they came and saw him having his complete and total psychotic breakdown in public on the sidewalk, compared to when last week they went to the bus station.
Right. Yeah.
And threw a woman into the back of the cruiser, no questions asked, just because a dude said he heard her say something crazy.
Yeah. Meanwhile, this dude, like, come on.
Nothing to see here, people.
Cuff him in the front. Like, he's got money. He does fund our police ball. Yeah,
right.
Oh gosh.
Anyway, what a time! What a time to be alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this one was kind of fun for me to see, because I was not expecting to be as surprised by it as I was. And I think that this one, like we said before, definitely doesn't have like that direct. And this is the movie that was basically entirely based on this episode. But I think there were things in it that we've seen kind of influence a bunch of different horror movies in different ways.
Yeah, and that's as much as we like to say, or as I've been saying, like, just give them credit for it. Like, I think that this is one that they could maybe get away with, because it's like, this is pretty like what there's been a ton of TV shows and movies where it's borrowed snippets of this anyway. So it's almost like it's just like public usage now, if that makes sense. So technically, I think they could get away with not saying that, they're directly influenced, but it's because you just be like, well, that didn't really happen. This is an alien invasion. That's why it's different, kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but if they do shout it out, they'd be a lot cooler. So
They would
just
be.
do it.
Just straight
Stop
up about
hiding
it. Pieces of shit. Fucking filmmakers. I fucking hate them.
That got aggro fast.
I go 0 to 100, man. I don't get it.
So I'm happy we watched this one. It was fun. It threw me for a loop there at the end. I am really happy we're doing this season. We've got, I think, 2 more episodes of this before we get into something else. And next week, we're going to be back with an episode called I Am the Night, Color Me Black. It was season 5, episode 26 from 1964. So if you're following along from home, check it out and then join us next time for the conversation.
I don't really have anything to add. So I'll just say bingo, bango, bongo. No, I'm going to change it. Bingo, bango, Django.
Boom.
Bam.
And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com. Or hit us up on the IG. That's what the kids call Instagram. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.